Welcome to the Road Home Podcast with Ethan Nichtern, author and senior teacher in the Shambhala Buddhist tradition. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
All right. So welcome, everybody. This is the 7th episode of the Road Home Podcast. I'm Ethan Nichtern, and today is a little bit of a different format because rather than having one guest, have three. And specifically, these three are young or younger. I don't think we can call any of us young anymore by objective definitions, but younger leaders in the Shambhala community. And I wanted to have my friends on because I thought we could have a really informed and honest and thoughtful discussion about what has happened in the Shambhala community this year, and also what we think the future of Shambhala as a Buddhist community, as a spiritual community, as a group of people who believe in enlightened society, what that future might look like. So these are dear colleagues and friends of mine. Three of us are currently in New York City. One is joining us from Chicago. So just want to run quickly through the introductions. We have Dr. Shanté Smalls, who's a teacher in the New York and other Shambhala communities, and they're a professor at St. John's University in African American literature and also performance studies. We have my friend David Perrin, who is a great drama therapist and Dharma teacher, also in New York City. Also want to have him back on at some point to talk about mindful parenting or mindful dadding. That'll be a great discussion. I hope he's into. And my friend Aarti Tejuja, who is in Chicago and is the director of the Shambhala Office of Social Engagement. And I think it would be fair to say that the four of us share a vision of making Shambhala really relevant in the modern Western world, and working, I think some of us have been working more than others on inclusivity in Shambhala and questioning maybe some of the marginalizing or even oppressive effects of spiritual communities and how those have influenced the Shambhala community. And, you know, just to introduce this, it's been for those of you who don't know, who are listening, it's been a really, really difficult year in the Shambhala community. Several reports came out earlier in the year in June and July with credible sexual misconduct and assault allegations against Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche, who's the head of the worldwide Shambhala community. Subsequently, the Sakyong stepped back from his teaching and leadership duties pending the results of a independent investigation, and the entire governing board of Shambhala International stepped down, and an interim board has been just named. So it's a time, and those of us who are teachers in New York, Shanté and David and I, the New York Shambhala Center is actually closing its current location later in the fall. So it's really a time of groundlessness and transition. And I guess I just want to open up, sharing that much. If any of the three of you want to say what you think happened this year that was meaningful, like what was the actual event? Obviously, so much of the world is coming to grips with misogyny and these instances of sexual misconduct, other issues we can talk about, white supremacy, etc. But beyond just maybe the interpersonal harm, like what actually happened to the Shambhala community this year? Does anybody want to pick up that thread to start?
It's a really great question, Ethan. This is Shanté, and I thank you for having me and David and Aarti on. And I've been actually thinking about this, like what happened? I was meeting with some students last week, and both of them, two of them said something to the effect of, how different their lives look now from 6 months ago. In particular, they were talking about plans they had for kind of their Shambhala path and training, and what's going on now logistically and emotionally. And I really feel like, beyond the specifics of Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche and other long-term leaders in the Shambhala community, I really feel like it almost feels like a lot of the family secrets have been exposed on the front page of the New York Times, and that for me, that's allowed a real freedom of sort of both my practice and all, in many ways, it's kind of loosened my tongue publicly. And I feel in some ways, like, oh yes, I'm very much a Shambhalian, and at the same time, I feel myself, I have distanced myself from the kind of organization. I feel incredibly committed to the lineage and to the practices and to working with students both in and out of Shambhala. And I also feel a sense that many of the things that I've been saying for as long as I've been involved with Shambhala, as well as other people have been saying, I just people are just saying enough is enough, and we're not going to kind of hold secrets. And so that feels very powerful on a personal level as a practitioner, and also as just a member of the community. It feels really important to be able to say, maybe I want to, kind of do my own thing within Shambhala or outside of Shambhala. And it doesn't have to be so. I feel like one of the problems for me in Shambhala has been that everything that I wanted to do had to happen inside of Shambhala. And there was a sense that if it was outside or adjacent to, that it wasn't really Shambhala. And I feel like that's gone, because the old Shambhala is gone.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really agree with a lot of what Shanté says. This is Aarti. I took on the role of the Director of Social Engagement. It's been almost 2 years. And I feel like the entire 2 years, and especially this year, the office has just been pushing and pushing and pushing. And in some very strange way, as painful as all this is, there's a little bit of a sense of liberation for me in this as well. A sense of freedom, like maybe now something could actually be possible. Whereas before, it just felt like things were really stuck. Like you knew that there was things going on, but you didn't really know what they were. It really, like Shanté said, it really does feel like, it feels like all the skeletons are so I'm not even sure how to articulate it in words, but there's a sense of freedom for me. And organizationally, I'm stepping down as the director of the Office of Social Engagement in December, January. And, I still feel extremely committed to the path. That part hasn't changed. And I've had people ask me, are you going to look for a new Sangha now? And that isn't it at all. Like, that isn't it for me at all. It's more like I don't feel a sense of needing to fix the organization or needing to put all the pieces back together of the nonprofit. I still feel a really strong connection with the path, but it feels like now maybe we can, we've been talking about creating enlightened society for a long time, and it feels like maybe now that's possible because we've just opened up like I said, the skeletons in the closet or something like that. So as painful as it is, there's something about it that's offering me personally a sense of freedom in some way that I haven't felt before.
Yeah, this is David. I feel older, to be honest. I just shaved my beard because it's all white.
which it sort of was before, but I feel like there's more gray hairs because it was, for me, I had a sense that everything was coming, and didn't know exactly, but even over the course of the last year, and having worked in Shambhala pretty actively in lots of different capacities over the decade, similarly to Aarti, like this feeling of why does it feel so difficult sometimes to get things done, to make things happen within Shambhala? So having felt that for a long time, and then getting little whiffs of what was coming over this past year, and also registering that within my own body in some strange way, just feeling the sense of anticipation. And then when everything hit this summer, there was, particularly when that second Project Sunshine report was issued, and right after I read it, I really had this feeling of almost like a death. Like I was not working. It was a period of time where it was, because it was during the summer, I was sort of on vacation. So I had like all this free open time. I was surrounded by family, and I was able to go immediately into this mourning process, which was very deep and powerful and kind of laid me out. And I felt very appreciative of that, because all of a sudden, as both Shanté and Aarti said, like there was a kind of liberation in my practice. Even right immediately, it was like any semblance of this old pretending that I'm supposed to be practicing for someone or for some group, or I'm supposed to be doing it a certain way because that's the way people have told me to do it for years and years, it just dropped. It fell away, and it was just the elements, really. Very, very basic. And shamatha, peaceful abiding, became super deep and powerful. And so, that I was in that space for a good deal of the summer. And by the time August and into, September came around, just feeling like, older and really in some way, like there had been, because it was sort of this death, it was this death of, for me personally, really relating to the more elder generation, the senior generation, Sakyong and folks who really have pioneered this. It's just kind of letting go of this idea that, that there was this parental vibe between me and them. And I'm always pushing, I'm always trying to like get them to see things differently or behave differently or say things differently, stuff that I've had experience with my own parents, right? And so that was just gone. I mean, that just feels gone for me. And that's very liberating. And I don't know what comes next, but I don't feel sort of weighed down by this need to always be sort of fighting with my parents about something that I care so deeply about. So that I think has been really, really liberating.
That's so, yeah, I think like Aarti and David, thank you for saying that. I was thinking about, I was on retreat with Sakyong a week before the first Project Sunshine, or the second Project Sunshine report was released. And it was really jolting to go from that space, which was very powerful, to be in the this kind of Dzogchen practice and these very high teachings that felt very deep and opening, and also very serious in terms of, I felt, like a real turning in my practice. And a real also sense of incredible frustration with the Sangha in there, looking around and seeing like, 4 of us who were like of the darker hue, and just being like, I can't do this shit anymore. Like I can't, be on retreat with 200 people and be doing this deep work and feel like, and have these really basic ass conversations that were just harmful and hurtful, and just made me feel like completely shut down, the opposite of what I was trying to do with these practices. I was like, out, because this isn't great. And, I really spent a lot of time crying. Just, my partner was so wonderful. I just couldn't even articulate words, just like head in lap. And for me, what has really happened for me, honestly, is I felt a real separation from the older students, or the Vajrayana students, who not necessarily the older students, but who I feel are sort of more status quo. And I've been feeling much more like finding my tribe and finding Vajrayana students tantric practitioners within Shambhala and outside of Shambhala who I just feel have a more open, sense-based relationship to this whole process. I did cover on my shrine, I have photos of the lineage holders, Trungpa Rinpoche and Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche, and for about 6 weeks, I took them down and or covered them, and I really I have now an ancestor shrine with James Baldwin and Harriet Tubman and Beyonce on, as well as my mom and grandma, and feeling just a sense of, I don't know what comes next, but I can't follow this script because this script didn't work. And it hasn't been working, but it's really not working, and that feels a little challenging. It feels for me it would be easier to just sort of be a cheerleader and go along with what I see as the status quo, but instead I feel very clear that I have to do some soul searching, and I've been doing, like David said, a lot of shamatha. I've been reading the sutras, the Buddhist sutras, the words of the Buddha, and conversations with the students, sort of starting from the earliest sutras and just studying things and simplifying and seeing where I have been complicit in the heuristic, ego-based thing about, that we kind of have in Shambhala, where we do think we're the best. And we do have something very special, but so do a lot of people. And I'm really trying to hold being special with not being better than. And for me, that's really meant stepping away from the organization. But I'm going to be teaching a lot in different Shambhala centers, and that feels really great. I was just in West Palm Beach in early October, and just getting to know that small, mighty community was really helpful to get out of kind of the New York bubble where we have so much comfort. And even though the center is closing its doors at its current location, there's still a lot of, just practitioners around. So I'm just learning a lot about myself, about my place within Shambhala, about my place within the larger Dharma world of the West. It's a challenging adventure.
So I'm hearing each of the three of you, thank you so much, this sort of balance, or this sort of co-emergence between a sense of mourning and liberation, and not having to hold on to things that weren't working. So I guess that's my next question. One of the things that's always fascinated me about Shambhala is that it's presenting a kind of Tibetan patriarchal structure, through the guru and then through some of the root texts of the tradition. And I always thought it was interesting because in the 1970s, this was presented, as Shanté pointed out, to a mostly white audience, but at least from a spiritual standpoint, a more progressive, maybe curious audience, like people who were stepping out of some of the religious or spiritual structures they had grown up with. And it's always so fascinating to me, and I've always had conversations about this, that it seems like, and I think this is true of a lot of Eastern systems of spirituality, that they're often presented to a slightly more progressive, mostly white in a lot of cases, Western audience, but the message is sometimes, okay, I know you folks don't like patriarchy, but here's a better patriarchy. And so I'm just, it feels like a conversation that we never really had, like one male figure who's in charge of everything, in this case, like all of the empowerments and all of the kind of blessings of wisdom and source material, which is embodied in this Sakyong position. Like somehow people, like, for example, like I know a lot of people in the community who work for Barack Obama's like very democratic campaign, and then would go pray to or prostrate to a Tibetan patriarch. And I was one of these people. So it's just interesting, like how does the real questioning of patriarchy that's happening in the Western world right now, does that play into this at all? Like, is there such a thing as a better patriarchy, or do we really just need to overcome that idea altogether?
I don't know that we have the answers to pretty much anything right now. It still feels like we're very much in a time of upheaval. But I just want to say that patriarchy is so wrapped in Asian culture, just coming from my family's from India, and just like spending so much time there. I mean, there's such a patriarchal culture in all over Asia. So I think something maybe we haven't considered is that we're already bringing a tradition over that already has roots of patriarchy woven within it, and we haven't really worked through that. So, and then you just you bring it into a whole other tradition here in the West, and you wind up with who knows what, and we haven't really looked deeply into it, I think. So it kind of makes me wonder, so I don't know the answer as to it almost feels like you're asking, how does this kind of Buddhism flourish in the West, or, can it flourish in the way that it has been? I don't think it can flourish in the way it has been. There has to be something that changes, but, as to what and how we do this, I still think that's still something we're trying to figure out. I mean, we all have these deep roots of patriarchy within ourselves. So to me, it's also an investigation of ourselves. Like, I've been looking at myself and seeing what are the ways that I am complicit in the patriarchy. What are the things that I do, and what do I hold? And there's a lot there, because I was raised in this culture, and then I was raised partially in Indian culture, and it was very patriarchal in my house. My dad was kind of the person that ran the show in some ways. So I feel like we have to start there somehow. But I think it's going to be a journey. I think it's going to be, that's just, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think similar to Aarti. I mean, I think a lot of, to some degree, and it's not new to this period, but soul searching and looking at my own ways. I've been thinking about the word access a lot recently, and this way in which, as a white straight man, identified, that access is something that not only is it not, you don't have to think about it, right? There's ways in which walking through the Shambhala doors, even though, I remember moving from Boston to New York, and so from a smaller Sangha to what felt like a ginormous Sangha, walking into a Tuesday night Dharma gathering, and it was hundreds of people there, but it felt like that. But most of them looked like me, and most of them came from backgrounds that I came from, and so there was a way in which, even though I felt the normal oddball feeling of just being one of a billion New Yorkers, there was a way in which very quickly I felt that I got comfortable in the community. I was able to give feedback, how I got involved administratively and helping to, volunteer and eventually help run the center was just through the old Shambhala School of Buddhist Studies, which was our educational program. And Derek Kalini, one day I wrote him a letter and said, hey, everyone just comes to these classes and they sit down and someone gives a talk and there may be a little bit of a discussion or Q&A, but then after that, everyone just leaves. And we don't ever sit around and talk to each other and get to know each other and build community through the effort that people are making to come to these classes. So that was my early kind of days of what is the community aspect of all this, and who are we, and how does the Dharma really apply to our relationships with our identities, and all this stuff that was sort of intuitive to me, but it was many years of unpacking what that stuff all meant to me. But still, the baseline was access, right? That access, I didn't even have to think about it. And as the years went by and I realized that access was not at all shared by so many, particularly in New York, it's so easy to see how that access is just denied, whether from any particular angle, whether it's around culture and identity, whether it's around socioeconomics, you choose the way in which people feel like they're not welcome in a Shambhala center. and seeing how that was just became more and more glaring, that was such a weak spot. It was a huge detriment to our community. Not only that, but that really the future in some ways, I think, of the Dharma in the West is about sort of being to not grant access, everyone's granting access, but see the resources that, as Shanté was saying, these folks that are on their shrine. I mean, the all the lineages that come to bear, that's to me what Shambhala, the heart of it was always about, the fact that this is about wisdom traditions from around the world and in every different corner of the world. And so it like blows open this whole notion of access, because it talks about where is real strength and power and wisdom held. And in some ways, Shambhala was just ignoring the deep pockets of that, the deep resources that are out there, that it just chose to, because it was replicating these structures that many of us had grown up in. So that if I, it was like basically all white people sitting around in this corporate boardroom setting when I was on the board of trustees, and that was what we were replicating, right? So if we're replicating those situations, then we're really increasingly at a deficit. In some ways, I think this whole situation was blown up as like, this is not tenable anymore. This is going to start to really go backwards if it hasn't already.
Yeah, there was a sense of, I always had the sense of the kind of strange intersection of like Orientalism and, in Shambhala, and like white supremacy. It was this really weird thing where there's like incredible deference to this really masterful teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, but also seemingly a lack of like, I don't know. It was like, it always struck me as like part of being in a relationship with a teacher is that it's a relationship and it's not just one way. And the kind of way we are like loyal or respectful is not just about being a sycophant. And, not having, I had a dream about this last night, maybe in anticipation of this podcast, but about like real love and real loyalty is about, there's truthfulness involved. And, I feel like at some point, early on my path in Shambhala, none of this was really a consideration because I didn't know about any of this stuff. It's really great. You come in and you sit and you do shamatha, you do these levels, and it, the shift really came later when I became a tantric practitioner, and I noticed it felt very different, and it felt very, my love for the Sakyong and the Sakyong Wammo was from the very beginning, before I had any kind of, tantric or vow relationship with them. But what I have always felt was a sense of, there was a slight veil. And for me, that veil fell from my own eyes this summer. I noticed my own kind of religiosity that was getting in the way of my actual practice. It wasn't helpful. In my own kind of way, I kind of just slipped and slid into the pocket of whatever I was being. And I feel now, because there was always a sense of like that I was going to get in trouble, and now I feel like I can do what I want. And, I had a conversation with the Sakyong a couple of weeks ago on Zoom, and it was very interesting for me. And I think probably for him too, because what I felt was really, it was just two people talking. And that, and me saying some things that maybe were hard for him to hear, but also us having a conversation about the reality of Shambhala. And I really feel that enlightened society is only possible if it's ground up. It can't be top down. Patriarchy around the world has failed us. No matter what your gender is or your sexed body is, it is failed us because it is based on a kind of idea of control and of kind of masking. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's sort of how it feels like it's really evolved. And instead of kind of being like a whole human, it's about kind of restraint and secrecy almost, if we're talking about in the sort of Eastern context or in the Western context. And so I think that, the answer is not simply matriarchy, but the answer is actually joining these two things and actually kind of getting out of this binary and really being like a full human being. I don't know how to do that. We're always saying, I don't know, but I think it's much more exploratory rather than kind of like edicts. I don't think edicts work anymore.
So, thank you all. I want to talk a little bit about a term that's been, coming up a lot this year, which is the notion of being complicit or complicity or enabling even, because it's so interesting in terms of how. We can always blame when something comes to the surface of an actual person who caused harm in the situation and this individual person did these actions, right? There's always a sense of personal accountability, which feels very important from a dharmic standpoint or just from a human standpoint. But it always occurs within a system where it's kind of allowed to happen or sometimes even, encouraged to happen. Like, I actually felt better about Shambhala after, I shouldn't laugh at all actually, but after all these stories came out, there was the report about just the state of Pennsylvania, the Catholic Church, and the sheer number of ministers, priests, of representatives of the church who had engaged in sexual misconduct. And it was to the level that you said this sort of thing is not an individual anymore. It's some kind of system is encouraging this. So I guess, that's related to, it's interesting, this link that Shanté brought up between, which is always really interesting in Western adaptations of Eastern spirituality, this link between sort of Orientalism or worshiping the elevated Oriental guru or leader versus the kind of structure that's created, as David mentioned, of all the white people in the boardroom. So, I've been studying my own complicity, not as a member of the inner circle, but as somebody who wanted to be liked, who wanted to be empowered, right? Shambhala works in these very staged ways to empower you as a teacher. And so how do we study, I guess that's the question, how do we study complicity without it becoming so complicated that we kind of lose our focus? Like, because it feels so important to not just say the guru sucks or something like that, but to say what happened here in a larger sense.
Yeah, I think we can't just look at, we have to look at the culture that we're perpetuating. So I've been really looking at transformative justice a lot this year, and transformative justice is really about how do we transform the conditions that make injustice possible in the first place. And I think we're all complicit. We're all going to be complicit in some way or another. I mean, there's just no getting away from that. And I don't want to say that there aren't incidents that happen that we shouldn't, look at, but I'm really interested in the idea look like to transform a culture. What does it look like to really go deep, and not just kind of be finger pointing one person and saying you did this, you're bad now, and that's the kind of end of it, because that's what we have right now in our world, and in our justice system right now. That's what we do. So I'm curious about exploring the idea of looking deeper than that. And not just that, but I love this sort of quote. I'm teaching a class in emergent strategies right now, from the book Emergent Strategies. And there's a kind of quote in here by Shira Hassan, who's a transformative justice guru. And she says, in order to resist one size fits all justice, we have to resist the idea that every process looks the same. And we need to acknowledge that we have no idea what we're doing. And that we're bringing a new collective consciousness out of the pain of losing too many people to colonialist justice. And I love that idea, because it's like, I think it's just acknowledging, like, we don't know, but we also know that what we have right now and what we're doing right now isn't working. So for me, the idea is just going deeper, and not just sort of fixating on idea of good versus bad. And there's a lot of blame going on right now. And for me, it's like, it's beyond that. It's like, how do we look at it in terms of healing? How do we heal our society? So.
Yeah. You know, some of the conversations that I've about Shambhala recently have been about a number of things that were, I don't know if working well is the way to describe it, but things were evolving. It wasn't as if that there were these, that it was only that there was these dark shadows and secrets that began to emerge, and that was really all that was there. So for example, you know, in New York, and I think that this was, you know, generally the work of the Office of Practice and Education within Shambhala to begin to move towards not just these very rigid, this rigid process, Ethan, that you mentioned of kind of empowerment of a teacher, that would be very centrally done, and you had to show up to a training at a certain time and place, and then you were authorized or you weren't to teach a certain section of the curriculum, and then you were never asked to or accountable to ever do any kind of continuing or professional development, or be in community, or be in kind of peer supervision with other members of faculty or other educators. And I think we were moving to a model that was more, that made more sense, which was to have these local faculty circles in different regions. And of course, there's still, I don't know about abolishing hierarchy altogether, right? Like that there should not be any Shastris or no Acharyas, no senior teachers within the mandala. You know, I'm not saying that, but I am saying that in my experience, when I sit in a group of people, particularly in a circle, and I think this is the power that I've experienced of the restorative or transformative justice, is that when interpersonal harm happens, like in the case of harm, it's not just between the two parties or the two individuals. That harm affects everyone in the circle. And the way in which that sort of colonialist mentality of an eye for an eye, and then we're going to, you know, that just takes care of it. It basically keeps everyone traumatized, because no one gets to really work through what was the harm that was done, how did it affect the whole group, and what are the appropriate, perhaps maybe more healing ways of enacting, you could say, justice, by holding the perpetrator, the person who's causing harm, closer into the circle rather than expunging them out, which just then creates the next cycle of the next harm that's going to be happening. So the fact that we were working in circles, both in a positive way within the faculty circles, that there was this ongoing professional development happening, that we were meeting monthly, the different topics. And in New York, what came out of that was the Undoing Racism, the race and racial inequality group was started, a patriarchy group was started out of the faculty circle. A women and non-binary group was started out of the faculty circle. So there was a very generative space in many ways. And even though, you know, Ethan, as you and I know, to be very honest, to be in the position of some sense of authority, to be on the Committee of Practice and Education, we ourselves, when it came to empowerment or what teachers we were going to ask to teach what, it wasn't always so clear. The process wasn't always so clear. And that was also something that we were inheriting from, you could say, above our pay grade. So there's that complicity, right? There's that thing. We're going along with the system that's been created. We're perpetuating a certain amount of confusion because we're not even totally sure how it works. But we're also right in the midst of trying to change that and create this faculty circle that rises up its own accountability, and rises up its own way of people developing and being given feedback in very straightforward, genuine ways. That, I think, Shanté, you said this idea of being able to speak the truth and to speak clearly and directly to one another, that's just the only way forward, particularly in this day and age of everyone, you know, the court of social media and people speaking sideways to each other all the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, that right speech element of things is is so the power in that right now is really being felt. And to sort of shout out Aarti's work is like this idea of developing the Office of Societal Engagement, conversation by conversation, dyad by dyad, you know, small group by small group. And that I love how you put in your final report, Aarti, about their work of this group, that you were basically doing community organizing, even though you weren't calling it that, because you were connecting people. And through connections, people can hold each other accountable and people can be real. If you're disconnected, it just can't happen.
Go ahead, Aarti.
Sorry, I just wanted to respond to that. I just want to say, like, people are asking me, like, why, some people are asking me, why am I stepping down in December? But I feel like the way we went about the Office of Social Engagement made it so that all the things that got started can continue. You know, we don't, in a way, I'm not necessarily relevant. I wasn't creating something so top down where I have to be in it or it'll just all fall apart. It was very much a community organizing philosophy in that people wanted to start groups and groups formed, people ran them, and that was great. You know, it's just a lot of relationship building and organizing. And in a way, you don't need social engagement to continue that work. And I think that's kind of an example of a structure that's not so top down. You know, it can survive without the leader at the top because of the way it was created.
I mean, I love that thing that Trungpa Rinpoche says about hierarchy. It's more like a flower than like a lid, you know, so that, you know, I know as a person who is a professor in my real life, I balance the work between teaching my students how to sort of teach each other and relate to each other as people who have know-how and knowledge and important things to say, but also knowing they need direction and instruction. And that I can't just like, what do you think? You know, that they actually crave that. And there's a balance and there's a reason. And there's a way to do that that's not disempowering or hurtful or just completely shutting them down. And I feel like, you know, one of the things that's really interesting to me right now is that the Sakyong has stepped back from all of his official capacities and things are still going. People are still having programs. People are still teaching. People are still learning. People are still practicing. And there's something about this that I think is really important for us to feel and observe and take note of. And I don't think that means that we don't need, I want a teacher. I need a teacher. But I think it's how. It's the quality of how does the teacher manifest, and can the teacher manifest in a way that's like fully human? And I've been thinking about how do we also hold the people who've been, you know, harmed specifically by the Sakyong and other high leaders, or how do we hold people who felt silenced? A lot of people have come out who've left, let's say Shambhala, New York, and said, you know, the reason why I left was because people would ask my input and would excise me or would do what they want to do anyway. And I'm struggling a little bit right now because I feel that the way that we're going forward with sort of one person who kind of, you know, and no tea, no shade to Acharya Spiegel stepping up, but we've never had a situation where someone just became the kind of interim ED because they had the time and the willingness. And it feels like this was an opportunity to actually do something different, and we kind of did not. And for me, that says that I need to figure out another way to relate to the New York Center, because I'm not convinced that we've learned anything about reassessing how we make decisions in times of incredible fear, incredible tension, incredible not knowing, how to be both practical and, you know, keep things running, but also how to have that practicality be rooted in community, get away from this like Western savior complex, and really not keep deferring the radicality of enlightened society by continually imposing U.S. standards of leadership, by just undoing our ability to emerge as an enlightened society because we're scared. And for me, that's my point of view. And for me, I feel like there's a way to have leaders who lead, but who bring people along so they also can be leaders. And I'm just feeling like looking to other centers and looking to other models for that is really important to me now to learn from. And I feel particularly called to do almost all the teaching I'm doing in the next 6 months is around people of color, or LGBTQ stuff, and that feels like absolutely where I can be impactful, whether that's in Shambhala or outside of that. And that has become my real bodhisattva practice.
So, if we had to look, one of the interesting things for me is that, the key phrase in the Shambhala teachings isn't about how structures can work, isn't about patriarchy or matriarchy. It's the term that Trungpa Rinpoche used was this sort of radical and sometimes controversial or hard to explain phrase, natural hierarchy, right? So like sort of replicating what occurs in the basic goodness of a naturally good working interdependent situation. And I wonder if that has been way too much interpreted as sort of a patriarchy, as part of the problem. So then the question arises, like, what is actually a natural hierarchy? And it seems like there's some kind of balance that we've lost, maybe completely, that you could say part of the issue I think we've been facing is that to have power in Shambhala a lot of times is to be close to the leader, right? And if you're close to the leader, there's some kind of sense of insularity and disconnect from the community or the audience, etc. And then I've heard some people say, well, yeah, but if the leader is not empowering people, if you're just looking to the audience, then that mode of power becomes like a popularity contest, and I think the person I was talking to said, well, Taylor Swift is really popular. That doesn't mean you want to empower that. And I said, well, depends on how you feel about Taylor Swift, but there does seem to be like, so what is there a danger in going too far in the other direction of sort of having this sort of like the completely ground up sense of hierarchy? Do we lose something in the leadership or the patriarchy, or the idea of like, and those of us who are teachers, like striking this balance feels really important. Like, how do we strike this balance? And what does a natural hierarchy ever look the same in different situations? I mean, maybe we were trying to impose the same solution onto every situation, and it was never meant to be that way.
I mean, for me, I've been studying some of the Shambhala teachings around the path of a householder, and obviously we use a lot of the teachings are framed in this notion of you're talking about natural hierarchy as being a provocative term. Well, so is the sort of imperial path, the monarchical path, this idea of having the guru as a king, and that there's a court, and all of these things that for many, I remember coming into Shambhala and you'd hear whispers of this language and people say, no, until you get to a certain point, you don't say anything about that could be wildly misinterpreted. Well, it was being misinterpreted from those very people that were whispering it, from my view. So, I think that those teachings, we're in such an infancy stage of understanding what actually those terma, those treasure teachings that Chogyam Trungpa introduced, but in some ways had their roots way before him. The Sakyong has worked to continue to bring out and comment on and teach from. We're such a baby stage of, I still feel so drawn to those teachings because I just think about, Ethan, you mentioned in your introductions of us, like, I'm a dad. I live in New York City. I have 3 kids. I have a partner. We live in an apartment, job, all of these ways in which the Shambhala teachings are talking about how to take your seat in your own life as if you were a monarch, as if you had the dignity of a Buddha in the world. And what does it mean to create a schedule for yourself where you have to cook meals, do the dishes, do the laundry, and make sure the kids do their homework and their chores? That where you have to look at how you think about the layout of your apartment, so that there's a place to practice, there's a place to rest your head, there's a place to study, there's a place to cook. And there's some very basic ways in which the householder path that Shambhala has really this revolutionary notion of taking it outside of a historically monastic context, and really rooting it in the stuff that we all have to deal with day to day, and relationships. And Shanté was mentioning how students look to them for guidance. It's the same way with my kids. Like, it's not that we're all equals in our household. There is power, but how to wield that power and hold that power from rooted in a view of selflessness, but then also being a basically good earth protector, right? This universal monarch, this Buddha in the world is. I feel like I'm going to spend the rest of my life just scratching the surface on what all of that means, because it does have to do with relating to power, because power is not going to go away, and power differentials are not going to go away. But how are people relating to that? And hopefully Shambhala becomes a place where we can really, honestly and truthfully deal with that, and still have hierarchy, and still have power be in certain places, and have what each person's place is in that, where their strengths shine, where they're working on the things that are their growing edges, have all of that be honored, and the dignity and the intrinsic worth of all of that be part of that flower that Shanté mentioned, and that whole garden of flowers. That to me is the Rigdon's wisdom blooming, as we say.
I couldn't agree more. I do think there's a way in which there have been a lot of sort of how can we change things and what needs to go, and that's it's important to have those conversations. But I think about, and I remember someone saying they felt like it was a scam because the Sakyong has all these transmissions, and they didn't need a transmission on how to keep their house, and it but at the same time people pay, what's her name, Marie Kondo, whatever, all that money to get rid of stuff and feng shui their place. So it's not about it's about, and I think particularly we need this in the United States, where there's it's about, these teachings are about dignity. Dignity, whether I've stepped in dog poop, or dignity whether I'm on the stage, and having a sense of dignity as a human being, treating others with dignity, treating myself with dignity, treating my environment with dignity, and that not being something I just do in the meditation hall or on the cushion, but that be a way I live my life. Living my life as it was a ceremony. Within anything esoteric, we do that all the time. Taking a train, taking the subway is a ceremony. Going to get your morning coffee at your coffee shop is a ceremony. How people get to their desk or whatever, and what they do first. It's all, checking their phone and their social media. So in this way, this ceremony, these kind of ceremonial things, or this kind of just way of being, wakes us up rather than puts us asleep. And I feel like those are things that I need to constantly be reminded of. And I appreciate having someone who's dedicated their whole life to that. I think what happens, or at least what in my experience, what can happen is that we forget that we get to a place where it's more performative than embodied, and that performative in the sense that it doesn't matter what's really going on. It's only about what shows. And I feel like what will be more powerful is being a full human being, being able to wake up from one's own shadow side, including the teacher, and not having to protect so much, because I want to be free in the world. I want to be able to help others. I want to be able to know what's right and what's wrong, and not feel like I have, all these secrets to protect. And it just falls into place rather than having to force things to happen. And so, I don't know, again, as, Aarti and David have been saying, and we've all been saying, I don't know what the answers are, but I think it's really about exploration, exploring our power, admitting we have power, and learning how to use that in a way that's about illuminating rather than destructive.
Yeah. And it's like, we do need teachers, and we do need certain roles, and we do need those things. It's just kind of what I've seen is we need our teachers, and we need people in those kinds of roles to really embody those. I see. So it's not a competition. In other words, it's not. I get to be a teacher, so I'm special. I see a lot of that still. Like you get seated in a particular role, and now you think you have power, or maybe you do have power, and it's all about how you work with that now. I've also seen it the other way, where somebody is empowered and they're extremely scared of their own power, and so they don't sit in that seat very well at all. And there's that, and then I've also seen it where I feel like I've really spent this year trying to empower people, and it's what I found really particularly interesting is when you empower somebody and you say, yeah, this is yours now. Sometimes it's so shocking because we're so not used to that kind of response, that I've freak out over that. And then not be able to sit in that because they just don't know what to do with that. And we haven't had any learning on when we do when we do have the power, how do we sit in that seat? And we often don't talk about that. So.
Yeah. I totally, that's a great point, Aarti. And we talk in New York about mentorship, and it's something Ethan and I and Shanté talk a lot about. And I do think that mentorship is so key. And that's one of the ways in which our little foursome here and our generation it's one of the things that we have really to offer, I think, in the rest of our years is creating this, I don't know if enlightened mentorship is really that, because that sounds it's hard to use the word enlightened in any context now with the kind of, hand in hand with the Shambhala hubris. I squirm a little bit when with that word, but even just, making an attempt to mentor in a way that really helps people to take their seat in whatever context it is. That's honestly something I don't think that the founding generation of Shambhala really had. I mean, they didn't. They had one very brilliant, iconoclastic, amazing teacher who laid out this whole smorgasbord of a world, and then everyone took up these roles as if they were very solid and concrete and like a job description that they were meant to have since birth, but there wasn't the mentorship there. And that's the way in which, many areas of the secular world and also other deep traditions, spiritual traditions, have figured out mentorship in a way that Shambhala is really, really behind. And maybe it's not that we're behind, we're just new. So we haven't known how to mentor folks. So I think it's incumbent on us. It's one of our, maybe our biggest job description, the four of us and everyone kind of who's been around Shambhala for, 10, 15, 20 years is making it our mission to mentor folks so that in a way that they can mentor. So we start thinking 2, 3, 4, more generations out, how this thing gets perpetuated with really a healthy transmission and a lot of humility and a lot of realizing that, we have a ton to learn and we're still making mistakes.
So thank you all. I'm having a great time listening to you all. And I one element that I wanted to bring in, because it feels like it's so present, not just in Shambhala or talking about the Sakyong, but talking about how power works in our larger political world. The relationship between power, and Shanté said something about protecting the powerful. And just the question, of when it seems like when we get into a position of power, there's a comfort around that. And there's a real fragility around that comfort being sort of attacked or invaded in any way. So obviously, you know, it feels as a straight white male, it feels very prominent in certain online political discussions of the white ego, the male ego, the cisgendered straight ego, like being attacked in certain ways where maybe it's just somebody, you know, expressing themselves and there's a real defensiveness that arises. And some of the conversations that I've been having this summer around what's going on in the inner circle of Shambhala have been equally very painful, because it's people talking about sort of trying to get the Sakyong to do something, but it really feels like protecting the fragility of the inner circle, and perhaps protecting the fragility of the person whose job it is to protect everyone else. In fact, his name is Earth Protector, you know? So I'm just wondering, like, and especially since, you know, we have two people on this call who are not of the straight white male, maybe we could hear from all of us, like, what do you notice about the ego fragility of the powerful, and what's the responsibility to deal with that? Because it feels like a huge part of this discussion is to be able to call out the powerful without them just getting their feelings hurt, and that being the end of the discussion feels necessary.
I mean, you know, I was having this discussion with Anne the other day. So Lisa and Bowden are my two boys. Reese is 12 and Bowden is 9. And, you know, we have really regular conversations around all of the things that are being exposed. But not only that, like a commitment to being able to talk about what it means to have our particular embodiment in this, and occupy the place of privilege that we do as a family collectively, but then individually. And I feel part of this as in my identity is to really feel the pain and sadness that I feel, and I feel it so acutely when I talk to them. Like, the part of me that wants to say, like, you're not a bad person, you know, you're not bad as a young white boy with privilege. Like, I know all these stories are talking about how all the ways that these men particularly have really screwed up, they've really effed up, they've really hurt people, and that so often is the narrative. But you're not, you know, you just because you identify doesn't mean that you're a bad person. And it's so complicated, right? Because so like feeling the pain of them, just watching their faces and feeling like, oh my God, like I've screwed up, or like I'm gonna do something bad because this is the embodiment that I have. But so sort of honoring that this is the legacy, and believing and trusting that these things coming out and us feeling them fully, and me feeling them fully, and feeling the sadness and holding the pain of samsara in my heart, but realizing that this is where we need to go. This is where I want to go. This is the world that I want to live in, where we don't have these hidden things that make us fragile, that for someone to expose us. And honestly, I've felt that my whole life. You know, I was talking about access before. Like, so much of my life, I felt that there's someone's going to come along and they're going to pull away the curtain, and they're going to see that, like, I shouldn't have had those doors open for me. Like, I'm a fraud, or ways of which I've been complicit, or just completely ignorant. And so there is a relief. We talked about that at the very beginning of the call. There is a relief, but there is also this pain and sadness that needs to be held by, I think, these men, you know, in order to be genuine, in order to come from a genuine place, to say when they did screw up or when they didn't, or who they're supporting. You know, I think a lot about, if I was in the Sakyong's position right now and he was in my position, would he forgive me? How would he hold and love me? And that's so informative in terms of how I see him, and how I see any of these friends of mine or other people that are not friends of mine who are in these positions of reckoning with what they've done, or how they've played out patterns that are deeply ingrained.
I wonder, I don't know, for me, what comes up when you say the ego and fragility of the powerful, I just feel like I have been challenging that all year, the last 2 years, like in every space that I'm in, literally in Shambhala. I feel like I've been challenging that, poking at that. And quite frankly, it's kind of tiring. There's something just tiring. And I really started to wonder, whose work is that? Is that my work? Whose work is it? And rather think of it as like, oh, this is all my work. But I like to think of it as like, we've got to work in our peer groups. You know, like I've been really encouraging men's circles this year, and white people doing white work. And, you know, we've got a white council now, White Awareness Council, that's figuring out how to do more white work in Shambhala, because we can create people of color spaces, but if the other work doesn't go on, and we just have white fragility or male fragility going on in our centers and going on within Shambhala, we're going to end up in this needing protected space all the time situation, even 100 years from now. So it feels like, you know, and so in order to, I think, do this kind of work, I think we have to, it's important to work in our peer groups, you know, so that a group of men are coming together and maybe have the full freedom to whatever they say without a woman or a person of color or, you know, whatever, being in that space who are, you know, quite frankly, it'll probably piss me off if I'm in a space of white men and they're complaining about something. So you know, but I understand that they need their space too to talk about what's going on for them. So, you know, so why not? Let's create those spaces.
Yeah, I think I just would answer your question by way of not directly answer your question and saying, I've been really thinking about how to really move out of spaces that are dominant. What's my investment in being in a space where I'm such a minority in a city that's mostly brown, black, and yellow, you know? And so I really had to think about my own complicity in this structure, and the kind of pain I'm inviting. It's really the only structure in my life where, you know, I live in a black neighborhood, you know, although the professor is mostly white, the students I teach are mostly black and brown, and a lot of immigrants. My partner is black. I don't really have this other space. And so I've been really thinking about what my proximity to this space needs to be. And I, you know, like I said before, I really feel that that white people and men and cis people need to figure this out themselves. There are tons of books, there's tons of work that's been going on for a long time, and I feel my real role and my real energy and my real investment needs to go to people who look like me, who don't have access to these teachings, because I feel that they are life-changing. And you know, for a black person to hear that they're basically good and really be able to get that message, I feel would, you know, change the world. So that's really what I'm, I think there are a lot of people, a lot of white folks in the Sangha, a lot of men in the Sangha or masculine people who are doing the work that needs to be done. And those spaces are kind of like, they're very findable. But I think also, you know, as a black person, as a queer trans person, I need to really be putting that energy there. And because I've been doing my work. And I want to, and I need to continue to do the work that I need to do as a human being.
Thank you. That feels really clarifying to hear from all of you, and especially, you know, it does feel, you know, watching the for example, the Brett Kavanaugh proceedings, that it's this that definitely white men need to be more honest. You know, I was David's point about access, you know, it was even watching him lie about how he got into Yale was amazing to see how defended and fragile that felt. He said he got into Yale without help, and it turns out he was legacy, which in Ivy League means a lot. So yeah, it's interesting as a white male. It feels completely. It's not the first time that I've heard that people need to each do their own work, especially those who are in power. But I guess it's it's a conversation I've had with Shanté too. There's also a sense in my own heart of like, don't leave me alone with these fragile people. But I get why I need to be. I get why we need to be, and at least I have Mr. Perrin with me along that journey. And so I guess, you know, we've had a really wonderful conversation. We've answered no questions, but I think we've brought up so many great insights. One thing that's been coming up a lot, working with students who are heartbroken over what's going on in Shambhala, who are, you know, in New York. I have students in a lot of different places, but primarily New York. People are really scared about the loss of space, closing of this location of the Shambhala Center, which is one of the largest urban Shambhala centers. So one of the things I say to try to be heartwarming, because I really do believe it, is that I think 10 years from now, I think 2028, I'm very optimistic about what Shambhala and actually the larger world could look like in the year 2028. I think 2019 is going to be a very chaotic year. So I wonder if you all agree with that assessment, that the short term looks groundless and chaotic, but the long term could be very positive for the Shambhala community and teachings. And if you do agree with that assessment, if you could share maybe one of the things looking farther into the future, like 10 years or more, that you're actually really excited about being possible within the Shambhala community or the Shambhala movement.
I personally think it could go either way. You know, as much as you'd like to think a big jolt like this might open up some answers or some change, you know, we're still rooted in all of these same structures. Like we ourselves are still rooted in all these things. That's still in us. So I'd really like to see us working with that as individuals. Like I'd really like an emphasis to be placed on that somehow, because I don't think we're going to get a different result otherwise. You know, as I still see a lot of people like trying to hang on to what we had, and I think this is not about hanging on to what we had. And if we're willing to let go of what we had and allow something new to arise, I think then there's a lot of possibility and a lot of really amazing things that could emerge. I myself, I'm really looking forward to hopefully be a part of the community in some way where I can teach, and then particularly continue the work of the Office of Social Engagement and what we were already working on, but more in a teaching capacity and working with individual centers, and less in kind of this like law been in. So I see possibilities, but it's just it'll be very interesting to kind of see what unfolds. I mean, I don't want to say I feel optimistic, and I don't want to say I feel pessimistic. I just feel like this is the time and the space to just be. And if we can really be in it, then something really amazing could emerge. But I think if we can't be with this and in it and let it be uncomfortable for a while, then I think we're going to jump back into old structures and habits and patterns. And that could happen too. So that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think that I really agree with what Aarti is saying in terms of that it's wide open and it could go either way. I guess a few areas, and I am really I feel very inspired. I feel inspired by the generation of students that's just coming up, and Shanté mentioned earlier, kind of finding their tribe, not only amongst like-minded or like-embodied tantric practitioners with a similar view and perspective, but I think I just, as a teacher, some of the folks who are earlier on the path coming in with such a high level of integrity and genuineness that I find my teaching a lot these days is just kind of convening this circle type of atmosphere and putting out certain prompts and helping to guide the discussion, just sort of similarly the way this discussion has been happening, where we're drawing out this wisdom that people really, I think something has happened over the past 40 or 50 years, Buddhism in general, but also the Shambhala community. There is, in one way, there's a certain taming, right? There's a certain way that people come in and they're working with their minds, and that's a natural thing. They're not just coming in and like lying on the cushions and they have no idea how to sit. People know how to sit. Mindfulness has arrived in that way. So one of the ways to reap the benefits of that is that as that taming process is underway from maybe an earlier stage with certain students, there's a way of accessing and gleaning some of the real insights of the teachings and having that happen rather than slower. So I'm curious how the path might reflect this higher level that I feel that the students are coming in on. And then the other areas, of course, as a family person, and I was supposed to go on retreat this summer as part of the Scorpion Seal teachings, these high-level teachings that the Sakyong and the Acharyas lead. And I decided not to go on that retreat because I felt like I was not in a space to do it. And I also was hearing certain information from senior teachers that I didn't feel so comfortable about. So I actually withdrew out of that. But the only retreat that I went on was family camp at our land center, Karmacholing in Vermont. And we worked it out because we had to, because there were families who were coming there who that's the only Shambhala space that they participate in the whole year. They don't even necessarily maybe identify as Shambhalians, but they believe in that space of these coming together to create a society. And so we had to deal with like what are the shrines were going to look like, and what we were going to talk to the kids about, and what rituals we were going to do, or what ones we were going to maybe dial back a little bit on. And it was such a wonderful, beautiful. It was like the one space where I really felt like a sense of healing starting to happen. And so in that, there was like a possibility for what can happen going forward. And here in New York, we're fortunate enough because we have a large enough Sangha that we have a number of families, and we have a monthly Bodhi school, and we meet together as this family collective. We'll go to Central Park and have a picnic and meditate with the kids, in Central Park. And so there's just a way in which I see that what family means in Shambhala to be a place where I personally want to invest. And also think that because, these generations coming up, including the kids, will have a lot to say about what they want to be involved in and what they don't, and what the vision means to them, both practically and on an inspirational level, and where it just feels off. And if we're ready to listen as our own version of elders and mentors, I think that we're going to hear a lot of great suggestions on how to organize, like 2 people at a time, 4 people at a time, 8 people at a time. And if we stay in that, that's my answer to the uncomfortability, is just like go out to coffee with someone who, shares your sort of faith in the Shambhala vision and teachings, and just talk and just be with each other. Like it's ironic that the Sakyong's last book, the most recent book was about the art of conversation, because I really think that that's the way that we're going to be carried into whatever the future holds.
Yeah, these are such great insights, and it's really wonderful listening to you both. On a personal level, I feel like I really am trying to just really bring these practices into my, interpersonal relationships, my romantic relationships, my family relationships, my work relationships, in a deeper level. And it's hard. It is challenging, but that feels like a really important personal practice. My sort of sense, I have no idea of Shambhala going forward is that I do think there are going to be multiple Shambalas, partly because of what both David and Aarti said. Is I think there's enough people who kind of want things to stay the same that there will be some sense of that going forward. And I think there are people who are like, I like this thing and it's mine and I don't want to leave. And no, I'm not down with that. And I actually think that's amazing. I'm really looking forward to that, models where it's not about centers necessarily, but about groups of people loosely gathered. It's about practicing. It's about connecting on Zoom with people across this country and across the world. So I'm looking for something that's sort of robust because it's sort of decentralized and people can kind of come and go as they want. The practices are there, the trainings are there. But I think, speaking for myself, I really want something kind of experimental and exploratory. And I think, hyper local. And, I live in a neighborhood where there are a lot of Shambalians, like in my neighborhood and adjacent neighborhoods. And, I just think we can continue to gather and see what happens. So I think that, I really think 2020 will be some indication of, you'll just see some of the fruits of what people have been doing and are doing now.
Well, I think this is a good time to wrap, and I just wanted to deeply thank my three guests today: Aarti Tejuja, David Perrin, Shanté Smalls. I'm sure we'll be continuing this conversation and this work, as well as doing our own individual work far into the future. This has been another episode of the Road Home podcast. Hope everybody tunes in and subscribes. And you can visit the webpage if you want more information on how to follow up with any of these three in terms of their work and websites and so forth. So for the Road Home podcast, this is Ethan Nichtern. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you, Ethan.
Thanks, Ethan.
Thank you, Ethan.